Thank you very much for coming to this last session.
Attending the final panel for today, the first day of the conference. This panel's topic is going to be on the Latin American experience and the Caribbean experience with armed conflict. عن تجارب أمريكا اللاتينية.
We're talking about the experience of the Caribbean and Latin America. We have Aldo Marchesi, María Jimena Duzán, Santiago Pérez, and Dr. Roberto Cajina. We begin with Dr. Aldo Makiti, who is a professor of history in the University of Republic Uruguay, and he will be speaking about the transformations after defeat, the cases at Tupamaros in Uruguay, and the armed left in Chile and Argentina. Please go ahead, sir.
Well, hello everybody. First, I would like to thank Omar for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Also, not just because the opportunity to know Qatar, that is my first time here, but also because it is really nice to have a conversation about very different historical experience that have a lot in common. No? So I think that it's a good opportunity to think not just in comparative terms about the experience that we are working in each panel. Also, I would like to promote the thinking about the connections, exchanges, movement of ideas, repertoires of protest and feelings that in many times you can see between some of these movements. So I really thank you the opportunity to be here in order to expose, to show the South America experience, but also it's a good experience to learn a lot about other cases that I don't know too much. Well, in my case, I was asked to talk about armed organizations from the southern cone of South America. By southern cone, I mean Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And basically, the kind of case that are gonna work here are related to this category that is presented in the title, the idea of transformations after defeat. No, we are not facing peace agreements. We are facing a process of transformation, but was a really hard process of transformation. It's after the massacre, to say in a historical way. Maybe this is the title has a kind of spoiling because we are telling the end of the story, because we mentioned one of these organizations that seems to be the successful organization, not that the Tupamaros, that is the case of, is related to the Uruguayan case. To begin, I would like to show a picture that is related to what I tried to show in my presentation. Well, this looks old right now, but it's not too old. It's a meeting of president of the Mercosur in 2012. And we have four presidents: Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, Dilma Rousseff from Brazil, José Mujica from Uruguay, and Cristina Kirchner from Argentina. Why I brought this picture? Because it shows the kind of relation between the past and the present that is still very important in the region. Two of these presidents belong in the 60s to armed organizations. No? Dilma Rousseff was part of a guerrilla group in Brazil, and José Mujica was part of Tupamaros, the urban guerrilla in Uruguay. Cristina Kirchner, even she didn't participate in any kind of this political movement. Sometimes she tried to vindicate this past and try to establish a kind of bridge between the 60s and 70s past and her government. There are many debates in Argentina about if this relationship is real or not, but this is another issue. So we can see how the past of the 60s and 70s is still very present in the political right now, but also we can see how some of the people who participate of this armed organization then have a successful trajectories, no? I think that I need to make some brief historical introduction to show the case. And first, I would like to present some of these organizations. This is just a poster of the 70s about a meeting of different urban guerrilla organizations from Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. These are kind of new guerrilla organizations in the context of the 60s and 70s because most of them were urban guerrillas, were not rural. After the Cuban Revolution, there is an emergence of rural guerrillas, but in the middle of the 60s, in the southern cone, when you have countries with more developed countries, there is an emergence of urban guerrillas with different kind of repertoires and with different kind of practice. 2 or 3 things to describe these guerrillas. First, they are national guerrillas, but they conceive as part of an international strategy. More particularly, they conceive like part of a Latin American strategy. This is a meeting of Southern Cone guerrillas, and there is a quote from Guevara message to the Tricontinental where he said that the war is an international war. No? The second idea is anti-imperialism. No? This is one of the main issues. I put some point in order to describe this movement. They claim that armed struggle is the only way of social change. They discredit of Cold War democratic liberalism. They are very critics, not necessarily for ideological reasons, but for political reasons. They argue that under the Cold War context, it's impossible that the left could be allowed to govern because the US will not allow leftist democratic government in Latin America. They describe themselves as guerrillas, and they are not described by the academy or even by the public discussion as terrorists. No, they target army, police, and international companies, and also they are part of a more general front. It's problematic if we think in this organization as just as isolated organizations without connection with other political organizations. So in each country, you have that these armed organizations are related with legal political parties, with unions, with other kind of social movements. And so this is the kind of beginning of this story. In the 60s, these organizations were defeated by a way of military dictatorships that covered the region. And these military organizations were not just against these organized armed groups. They target other type of organization like leftist political parties, even center leftist political parties, even center political parties, also civil society organizations. And here just we have numbers about the victims of this kind of terror politics promoted from the state. In the southern cone, I think that the first time that the word state terrorism was used was in the southern cone, and it's kind of inversion of the notion of terrorism. No? There was a lawyer who created this idea to say, in fact, in the southern cone, the problem were not the armed organizations that provoked terror. It was the state who spread the terror against the whole society. No? But in the 80s, we have a gradual change in the region. There is a progressive opening of these dictatorships. And in the context of, also in the context of many changes in geopolitical terms, there is in the 80s, and we are facing the end of the Cold War also. And there are many changes that provoke deep changes within the survivor of this experience of the armed left. No? I point just 3 issues that, in my opinion, are relevant. First, there is, in the Latin American left, there is a revalorization of liberal democracy. Some people who thought in the 60s that liberal democracy was just an argument of the empire, they begin to rethink about the values of liberal democracy. In the southern cone of South America, this is really important. There is a kind of shift of intellectual paradigm for many leftist activists, some that were part of the spirit of the 60s and were part of the spirit of the guerrillas. Second, there is, and related to that, there is an intellectual and political transition related to the idea of human rights. The idea of human rights was very important in the movement against dictatorships in these countries. And this political paradigm also has had some kind of effect on the survivors of these armed organizations. No? It was really difficult to face this new kind of paradigm. I mean, if in the 60s they claimed that violence was the way to achieve social change, this idea in the 80s, when you have the ideal of the human right as a utopia of a new society, is very difficult to claim violence as a way to promote social change. No? So this creates a dilemma for these guerrilla members about how to face this new reality. No? We can say that they were between the old revolutionary political culture that came from the 60s, or the new human right and liberal democracy discourses that were growing even in the social movements. No? And what I will show are, sorry. What I will show now is two different cases about how different organizations face this dilemma. No? The first case is in Argentina. The new democratic government had one of the big questions of the transition to democracy was how to deal with the violence of the past. No? There was the main problem was related to the militaries. They still have power, and also they were the responsible for the big massacres of the 70s and of the 60s and 70s. But in each country, government defined different strategies to deal with the problem. In Argentina, the new democratic president choose the so-called two devils strategy, which is the meaning of this idea that the new democratic government have to face the two forms of violence that were in the past. That the new democratic government had to promote justice related to the actions perpetrated by the guerrilla members, and they have to promote justice for the action perpetrated by the militaries. No? This strategy, Alfonsín want to maintain a kind of balance between these two actors, although it was not really true, because the real threat in the 80s were the militaries. No? But this kind of strategy was more a kind of rhetoric strategy, but had political effects. And then I will explain which kind of effect it had. On the other side of the river, in Uruguay, okay, Julio María Sanguinetti established, that is the first democratic president, established a different kind of approach. He promotes an amnesty law that give the freedom for the prisoners of conscience, and he commutate the sentence to those former guerrilla members accused of violent crimes. No? In this case, then initially Sanguinetti did not have a position about what he will do with militaries. Then he just give an amnesty also to militaries. No? So this kind of two strategies had a deep impact on the survivors of the guerrilla organizations in the 80s. I will work in one case that is a kind of failure, that is the case of the Argentinian PRT, ERP. The meaning is Worker Revolutionary Party, Army Revolutionary People. One of the few guerrilla leaders who survived from dictatorship was required by the justice during the 80s. That is Enrique Gorriarán Merlo. He was in Nicaragua at that moment, and he could not come back to his country. He had to stay in Nicaragua, and he was not able to re-engage in the democratic process. Even he was in favor of the democratic process. No? And from Nicaragua, he promoted a new political legal organization in Argentina, but it was a kind of ambiguous legal organization, because on the one side, they have a political front, they have a journal, they have committees in different cities of Argentina, but on the other side, their leadership was clandestine. And he was not able, and there were many leaders of this organization that remain in exile. This kind of ambiguous integration that is related to the two devil strategies had a deep impact in the conformation, in the building of this legal organization. In 1989, this group reinitiated the armed struggle. No? It's in a very confused episode where they claim that there is a menace, there is a threat of a military coup. There is a danger that the militaries return. They decided to took a military headquarters called La Tablada, and the result was just a massacre. There were 35 people were died, 70 were wounded, and there were around, this is not just correct, there were around 100 people that were in jail as a result of this action. So this marked the end of the attempt to be reintegrated to the new democracy by the PRT ERP. On the other side of the river, we have a kind of successful transition to political activism, that is the experience of Tupamaros. Tupamaros most of them, that the Tupamaros that were in jail were liberated in 1985 as a result of the amnesty law. And just this code showed that the relation with democracy since the beginning, it was a kind of engaged relation with liberal democracy. No? The idea that the democracy of the past was not a real democracy, but this democracy that was the result of the popular mobilization, and it was linked to their own liberation, is a real democracy. No? And this established a new kind of relation with democracy that was really important to understand the gradual engagement in political activism. Gradually, they begin to participate in social activism. Initially, they promote social organization. Initially, they were reluctant to participate in the Congress. They were reluctant to participate in electoral politics, but they then established alliance with some legal political parties, and during the 90s, they decided to participate in the electoral process. No? And the result of their participation was really successful because they promote a new kind of political activism related to their experience of the past. I mean, the kind of values related to the armed struggle were reconceptualized in a political way. The ideas of sacrifice, compromise, that were related to a kind of ethical values related to the armed struggle were resignified in the context of the political political contention, no? in the context of the political electoral arena. Here is the beginning of a kind of successful career initially as a deputy of Jose Mujica. No? Here we have Jose Mujica in the 90s. He went to the parliament with dressed in a very untidy way, with a Vespa, no? This motto that was. He has a kind of style that it was very rupturist for the kind of traditional politics, no? And this kind of cultural approach to politics, it was very related to their own experience of the 60s. I mean, it was a kind of rethink of politics, rethinking of politics in Uruguay. So, after showing these two examples, I would like to end like two ideas. No, what we see in two cases. First, we see a process of ideological adaptation. No, that these guys do not resign to their own legacy, to their own ideas about the 60s and 70s, but they try to engage with new conversations about human rights, about social movement, about revalorization of democracy. But in any case, in Argentina or in Uruguay, they don't regret their participation in armed organizations during the 60s and 70s. In this process of ideological adaptation, they try to create new organizations in both countries. No? But what happened that in one country this experience was successful and in other it wasn't. There are so many differences that we don't have time to establish about both countries, the political culture, the traditional political parties in each country. But there is a point that seems to be very crucial, that is amnesty laws. No? The idea that the amnesty law in Uruguay allow Tupamaros to recreate their own political culture in democratic terms. No? Just this, and then I will be open to questions I hope that I am done. No? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aldo. Very interesting overview. So our second participant today is María Duzán, correct? Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
A writer and journalist from Colombia. Her new book, sorry, I have it written in Arabic. Santos: Paradoxes of Peace and Power, is basically outlines the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC. So today her paper is titled Political Reintegration of Demobilized Combatants in Colombia. So please go ahead.
Well, thanks very much for this invitation, Omar. Thanks very much. My first time here in Qatar as well, and in Doha. And you will excuse me because we have 20 hours of flight, and I have a jet lag, as big as my head. So, but anyhow, I will do my, my best. Well, I've done, for the last, I would say, 20 years, I've studied the conflict in Colombia. I'm a journalist. And in especially the last 6 years, I've been much more interested in trying to report and in order to understand what happened, really, in the peace deal we cut with las FARC. So that's it's been my experience, and I've done a case scenario of las FARC and what happened after they were demobilized. Actually, the FARC were defeated within the ballots, by the ballots, and not in the military ground, which is quite a different way of approaching things. But anyhow, after 60 years of war, las FARC ceased to exist as a guerrilla and became a political party 6 months after we cut a deal with las FARC in 2016. Big achievement for Colombians because it ended a conflict that causes lots of troubles and worries, and almost 3,500 Colombians killed, and at least 80,000 disappeared, still disappeared. So it ended the longest conflict in Latin America. So it was very important for Colombians. What happened when we cut the deal? Well, the reincorporation process was done in 2 phases. The first one had to do with how they end up laying down the arms, which was very important for Colombians and very important for the government at that moment and for the society. Well, after all the negotiation done by Frank Pearl, among others, that was really a good member team that was built by the government. The government and las FARC decided to sit down and finish this process that took like 6 years of negotiation. After that, 12,700 members of las FARC have been demobilized since the peace agreement was cut. Thanks to that, numbers, Colombia is facing the lowest rates in homicides in the last 42 years. So it's become very important for Colombians. Right now, the reincorporation process has 2 sides. The first one, it's been very tricky as well, the social one. Right now, there are lots of former combatants within the regions because they regrouped the army, where the former guerrilla are right now regrouped in certain areas in Colombia, and they're waiting for the programs, the social programs, to go there, sponsored by the government, and they have been received benefits that were agreed in the government in the peace deal. Sorry, like for instance, right now they have something that they really appreciate. They do have IDs. They became legal. No fake IDs, which was is ancient life. And they do have as well the benefit of the social care in Colombia, which I don't know if it's a good benefit, but anyhow, they do have that sort of benefit as well. What are the big tasks? I mean, we're facing the most important task is in the implementation process. As far as we know, 60% of the peace process are really, face the most difficult moment, especially in the implementation process. Well, we are facing that sort of crisis, especially because President Santos did cut the deal, didn't have time to implement, the peace process. So we have to wait to see what was going to happen in Colombia. And so the new president won, office, claiming that he was against the peace process. So we're still yet to know if they are really, or the government's really wanting to implement the peace process. So that leads us to another task, which is most difficult to cope with, is recidivism. I mean, we have tons of dissidents in the last 2 or 3, I would say, months. The increased number of dissidents of Las FARC has increased, and at least we have right now, according to the last numbers, 1,500 dissidents from Las FARC, that had gone back to the armed struggle, which is, kind of not very good news, but I wouldn't say an armed struggle. They went back to something quite different from the armed struggle. They went back to be part of something quite different. I would say it's more or less linked to the drug narco-trafficking business, more criminal organization than real guerrilla warfare. Well, so the other task we are facing, which I think it's important, happens in the political reincorporation. Well, under the terms that we cut the deal with Las FARC, in exchange of having laid down their arms, the FARC was allowed to participate in the first elections that were held this year. Well, the FARC didn't do well. Actually, they were defeated in the ballot. After 40 years of armed struggle, they were defeated in the ballot. And his presidential candidate had to suspend the political campaigning after protesters disrupted its rallies. And the opposition was very aggressive. It was something that it was difficult to cope from the FARC standards point of view, and in a way, it made at that time impossible for this candidacy to really grow up, and they had to stop. So they couldn't present a presidential candidate. In the congressional elections, they only got 0.03% of the votes, imagine. And they were only left with the 5 seats that were agreed in the deal in each of the 2 chambers of the parliament. So yes, we have them right now in the parliament, but they were defeated in the ballots. Reasons. Why on earth, after all the sacrifice we did, we end up, in such a difficult moment in terms of this political reincorporation for Las FARC? Well, there are many reasons. Since we don't have so much time, and I have this jet lag here in my head, I think that one thing has to do with what Professor Gordon was saying, what happened with Las FARC, or not only with Las FARC, we have been doing lots of peace process throughout the last 25 years. And every time we do a peace process with the guerrilla, in Colombia, immediately the guerrilla become a political party, immediately moves from the far left to the center, and disappears as a party, as a political party, Well, Las FARC did, like Gordon said, like Professor Gordon said, the FARC decided to preserve their radicalism, you see, and became, a new party, but with this sort of narrative that was really strong and radical. Well, it didn't work as well. It didn't work. Many people think in Colombia that they haven't been able to get in touch with the public opinion and that they still talk only to the grassroots movements, the peasant movements, in which they had their strongholds at that moment when they were a guerrilla. Nevertheless, I think that what happened, although we have lots of problems, the other problem, sorry, I just remember, the other problem that was very interesting about Las FARC, deciding to be a radical new party, it was that they stayed with the same acronym. They didn't change the name, not even the name, see? They were called FARC when they were, within the armed struggle, and when they became a political party, they came up saying, we don't want to change our name, so we want to be remembered as Las FARC. So Las FARC didn't change their acronym, and so that didn't, that was a very difficult message in terms of public opinion in Colombia, because they didn't understood at that moment what was the FARC doing. But anyhow, they decided to radicalize their narrative, and they end up being a sort of a very different party and a different, protagonist, one could say, of the new Colombia. But what happened is that even that Las FARC didn't do well in the ballots, what happened in Colombia was that the peace process helped to open up the system. And it was amazing. Las FARC didn't do it, but the former guerrilla movements that 25 years ago, decided to dismantle themselves and became parties and became members of the center stronghold in the establishment in Colombia, well, right now are the new leaders, and they have very important role in the scenario, in the political scenario in Colombia, and they won lots of seats in the last elections as well. So it's a paradox, but in a way, right now we are much more, plural country in terms of political options. Political options are much more open, although the FARC are not there as a protagonist as we once thought they would have to be. We still have to learn lots of things in Colombia. First, we have to wait what is really the new president's policy towards the implementation of the deals, because that's the main thing that's uncertain up to now. But we have to learn the meaning of words that we still yet don't know. Reconciliation, we don't know the word of, the meaning of the word of reconciliation. We don't know the meaning of the word empathy. This way in which you have to know how the other one that suffers as you suffer, how on earth the other one is suffering as well, and because it's a human being, as Frank told us. But it's when you fight a war, as long as we had in Colombia 60 years, that empathy, the society loses the ability to really feel what the opposite, or the person that really harmed you is feeling. So we still have to know, what is the meaning of this empathy. We don't know the meaning of tolerance still. We don't know the meaning of forgiveness. And we're still, trying to learn many things, but we do know two things. First, that the FARC was the end of an utopia, what we call an utopia. A good friend of mine, is a very well-known journalist for The New Yorker, did a profile on las FARC, and that's why it's so important, the story of las FARC, and portray, and the title he put on the profile he did of one of the commanders that lead the negotiations representing las FARC, the title was FARC, the end of the utopia, see? Because it's the last guerrilla in the hemisphere, Marxist guerrilla, that was really believing in the armed struggle. So one thing we know is that in Colombia, the armed struggle, it's gone. And that's a good news, although we don't know the meaning of reconciliation, empathy, or tolerance or forgiveness. But on the other hand, we're starting to kind of go into the direction of a normal country, because we still were the only country in the world, I don't know, still facing the Cold War scenario. So right now, I think that the FARC have acknowledged that first, armed struggle in Colombia hasn't got popular support, which was, what we acknowledged when they didn't do well in the ballots, And the other thing that's happened is that we've learned something, that one thing is to dismantle a guerrilla, although, it's an enormous guerrilla, it's as well, it's, I don't know if you know, but it's the biggest guerrilla. I don't think you will find as a guerrilla right now in the world like las FARC. That was the last one, the last of the Moicanos, see? But we have learned another thing, that the real peace is not there yet, that we have to build the peace, that we have to start a battle for the peace. And that's the battle we are just starting, see? So that's quite different. And I think I'm very optimistic, although we have a lot of things, to do, and we're facing lots of tasks, monumental tasks. When I was young, which was quite a long way ago, see, 25 years ago, I remember that that my country was the country of three things, see? I always, Pablo Escobar, see, the Pablo Escobar, the guerrilla, country of the guerrilla, because when I was 25, as I recall, there were more guerrilla movements than parties in my country, see? And we were the country of the beauty queens. We produced beauty queens, see? That was what we do. Well, 20 years after that, I think we are better off. I mean, we don't have more Pablo Escobar, because all the thugs we have right now, I mean, none of them have, really have to do with the sort of monster that was Pablo Escobar. So that's okay. We do have problems in terms of thugs and narco trafficking business, whatever, but none of the thugs that are right now, within the underworld world, are like Pablo Escobar, which is, something that we gained. Guerrilla, we just have only one. We only have one. Instead of 5 or 6, we just only have one. We still have ELN, and I hope that this guerrilla will, end up doing, or at least we'll cut a peace deal, thanks to Cuba as well. Cuba is helping us as well. Cut a peace deal with ELN in the oncoming years. Still, we are a country that produces beauty queens. I hope I can cope with that. I don't have a problem with that. But I think that, I would like to finish my presentation here. Thanks very much.
ثالثا معنا دكتور سانتياغو بيريز، باحث ونائب مدير مركز الأبحاث للسياسات الدولية والاستراتيجية في هافانا كوبا، متخصص في السياسة الخارجية الكوبية والاتحاد السوفيتي السابق، واليوم راح يقدم ورقة بعنوان من حركة ثورية إلى دولة ثورية حالة كوبا.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that in this panel we have the Olympic record of millage being flown. So maybe that's why we would desert more time, right? In the in the time of answers. My presentation is from a revolutionary movement to a revolutionary state. The case of Cuba revisited. And I'm talking about one of the 10% of the forces that Omar presented today that won, that took power, that the whole process afterwards have not been the result of a defeat. I want to thank you and Doha Institute before going on. So I'm going to talk about 5 points. First, I'm going to make some methodological points. Second, I'm going to talk about the features of the revolutionary movement who took power in Cuba in '59. Third, the issue of transforming the state, because it was a real challenge to rule the state, being a revolutionary movement. Then talk about the role of external powers, mainly the USA and the Soviet Union each time. And fourth, I'm going to deal with a little bit on Cuban foreign policy, because I have been asked to talk about that. As you know, Cuba has been, for a long time, the first revolutionary movement who took power in Latin America, at least after the Cold War. So after during the Cold War, so it's interesting how to realize that in a more comparative analysis. So talking about the methodological points, I congratulate the organizers in terms of making these comparisons, because what you see in the Middle East maybe what you saw in Latin America, or maybe what you see in the Middle East in other parts of the world would be the future of Latin America. Nobody knows. So because history has not ended. So the whole bunch of problems being arise here is a very good point for analysis in our respective areas. That would be the first point. Second would be the importance of history, because history gives you the whole set of mentalities of actors who are working in nowadays different political countries. So what I'm going to do is not a methodological approach to the Cuban Revolution. All of you more or less know the most important periods, but just to figure out some things that I think that are important to analyze the how and why a revolutionary movement, an irregular force took power, and how it was able to maintain that. Third, the role of contexts. Contexts are important, international, regional, but from all my research has been that the domestic issues, the most domestic factors, domestic drivers are much more important. The other point I just mentioned, the fourth one, is that Cuba is an interesting test case, because after the experience of the Cuban Revolution was taken by a lot of other guerrilla movements and other even movements all out of Latin America, and so it's interesting to reanalyze that. To reanalyze in a revisited way, because I think that there has been a lot been written on Cuban revolution, Cuba domestic issues, which I think that needs to be reanalyzed. And because the issues that were arising during the process of the Cuban Revolution are also nowadays realities. What to do when you are a revolutionary movement, what to do after coming to power. What are you going to do with liberal democracy? What are you going to do with the state? What are you going to do with the mass media? What are you going to do with the economic power of the existing ruling elites? What are you going to do with the external challenges? And I think those are questions, and I'm just taking history as a pretext, to put in a debate a lot of issues that are today, nowadays, questions specific in Latin America, but in other countries. Look at the case of Venezuela, look at the case of Nicaragua, look at the case of other countries. Brazil, who would dare to think about fascism or neo-fascism coming back to Latin America? And look at a country which represents 40% of Latin America is under a person who has claimed publicly that he would kill a lot of black people. So we are thinking in terms of history, but challenges that are today, and that would be for the future. What would be the features of 26th of July revolutionary movement that I would like to highlight? First, the legitimacy. The movement all the time claimed that they were acting against the violation of the existing constitution that Batista gave a coup d'etat, an overthrow. So that would be a very important point to understand the way it got to power. Second, and here history comes again, the whole strategy and the whole tactical way of conducting military affairs, clandestine operations, or political work was based on the previous experience, which was not communist, which was from Antonio Guiterres, figure which is not pretty well known, but who, after the revolution of '33 in Cuba, tried to implement more or less those kinds of tactics and strategy than Fidel Castro and the movement of 26th of July then implemented. The third point has to do with one concept that the movement had, which was how to deal with the issue of frustration. Cuban independents were frustrated because when they got independence from Spain, the Americans took it away. They were frustrated because in the revolution 1933, they couldn't stay in power because there was Batista coup d'etat. And they were frustrated because of in 1944, came to power the government of Mr. Grau, who had been considered to be revolutionary figure, and he ended up in corruption. So the whole idea was what to do after we take power. Should we repeat the cycle of previous experience that ended up in frustration? So that was part of the drivers and part of the whole discussion within the revolutionary camp. And here comes one, I think, interesting point in the whole Cuban debate of that time, which was the concept of revolution, la revolución, which was used, and even prior to, in the 19th century, Jose Marti used that, which is a concept, which is a myth, which is a process that is much more than a specific normative act. And here it explained why Fidel, in the initial parts of the revolution, he said, revolución sí, elecciones no. So changes, revolution, yes, elections or representative democracy, no, because it has been proved that it has been used by the powers that be and by the elite in Cuban society to frustrate the anxieties and the needs and the whole interest of Cuban broader classes that has made the revolution. Another feature, the fifth feature of the 26th of July movement, they were active. They were determined to take power, and look what they did in Moncada. Even though they failed, they started again. So for the broadest masses of the population, they were considered to be heroic, and they were heroic. Look at what they have done, and also in terms that they were organized. So they could move so many combatants from the western provinces of Cuba to Santiago de Cuba, which is in the eastern part, without Batista system of intelligence knowing that. So after the attack to Moncada, people were saying, these guys are not only determined, but they are able. They are organized enough to do that. The other feature, which is more known, their discipline, widespread. They had cells all over the country. I'm comparing with also other movements that you have had here in the Middle East, in other areas. And they used the clandestine movement in the cities, which was very important, but at the same time, the fight in the Sierra Maestra. And they have developed another feature, work with women, workers, student, middle class, propaganda, front, and actions. The issue of ethic, the issue of what we say in Spanish, principles, was very important. So the idea of having a coherent strategy. And here it comes the issue of humanitarian way of treating even the prisoners, which gave a lot of credibility to the warfare. And afterwards, Fidel Castro said that was also, apart from the humane consideration, the issue of how then you are going to surrender the enemies if they think that you are going to kill them. So that's why at the end of 58, an army of 3,000 soldiers or combatants defeated an army of 80,000 people. That's why, and because of their using also of a sophisticated guerrilla tactics, which was also very important. The idea of coherence was also a feature of this movement. Remember that after being taken prisoner, Fidel Castro pronounced "History will absolve me," which became a program for the movement. The idea of not only taking power, not power for the sake of taking power, but to implement reforms, to implement changes, was very important during the whole process in the war, and then after taking power. As far as you are taking your 5 minutes, I'm going to be faster, but I just wanted to make one point: the use of mass media, while in Sierra Maestra or in the clandestine cells, they used radio. At that time, there was not internet. But the use of radio, the use of, when it's possible, TV stations, and that was important, at least for that time of political culture in Cuba. And they linked with exiled communities and with other international audiences. So that this movement had cells in Miami, in other parts of the US, in Venezuela, in other areas of Latin America. And that helped them to become internationally recognized after the triumph of the revolution. Okay, they got to power. What would be some features that I would like to highlight? From 59 to April 61, and I'm not making a chronological analysis, but just to highlight, because I think it would be interesting just to take that into consideration. The first thing Fidel Castro did was to go through Cuba in what he called a caravan of liberty. He could come from a helicopter to power in Havana, but he didn't that. 8 days he was making speeches all over the towns in Cuba. So the idea of using and reproducing the political capital they have won in the war. The pedagogic approach all the time, not only him, Che Guevara, Raúl Castro, others, were all the time interacting with people at different levels. Look what he said, the 8th of January, 59 in Havana. It was not a specific column or a specific front of the rebel army who won. Who won this war was the people. So the idea of participation, the idea of empowering people was very important. Very interesting tactical move was to remain out of the government and out of presidency for 6 months, out of government for 2 months. And he said that in his memoirs, that he wanted to get away from government to have the possibility of criticizing it, and to use some figures from the existing system, from the upper classes, in order to legitimize the changes that we're about to do. The centrality of security apparatus, the G2, which was very famous to come from the US CIA and FBI and other areas, the importance of military structures to unify that. And was interesting because they dismantled the existing Batista army, but they paid the salaries. So it was not, here we are, here we came, here we won, and you're out. No, it was a process of dismantling that, paying the fees for the soldiers, etc. And the pace of changes, the idea of previous experiences taught the Cuban rebel army and the Cuban who came to power that you had to fulfill what you have promised. If not, people are not going to believe you. And second, you have to do things quickly, because they knew and they had preemptive analysis of what would be the US reaction. In 54, only 5 years before, they have done intervention in Guatemala, so they had all that into considerations. Which were the important transformations they did. They made the beaches for the public use. They reduced the tariffs for telephone companies, electricity companies, so things that hit the people's earning capacity. And then came the Agrarian Reform, which has been, I would say, a cancer for all of Latin America. And it has been in the previous Cuban constitution. They implemented that, not a very drastic one, but an Agrarian Reform which immediately triggered the US reaction, because they were the most important landowners in Cuba, and all that generated a very polarized class struggle and polarization in general of the Cuban society. Here comes a lot of immigration, etc. This transformation were given. The peasants, for example, was favoring 100,000 peasants who became immediately support for the revolution. And Fidel Castro said here, prior to April 61, who was already the vision of possible invasion of Bay of Pigs, if we stopped at that time, it would have been a cowardice in the sense of national pride of political figures in Latin America. It's very important. Cowardice and a treason that would have led us to be again an American colony or slaves to the exploiters. The American property was so much inextricably linked to the Cuban upper class interest that immediately they were against the transformations of the revolution, and they withdraw with them the Cuban political elite in the Union. So the Cuban political elite didn't stay in Cuba, didn't fight for their rights as there was been doing afterwards in Nicaraguan experience or Venezuelan experience or other ones. Just to tell you one figure, they nationalized 36 American sugar mills. They nationalized the American banks and 160 American companies. Apart from, they used that situation, 383 national companies. After that, the U.S. for sure broke relations with Cuba. January 61 established the blockade that we know, and yesterday there was another defeat to the blockade by the immense majority of the international community, and all that triggered the invasion of Bay of Pigs. The issue with the Soviet Union, with one brief point, the Soviet Union didn't come. It was invited to come to Cuba as a move from the Cuban leadership to confront the U.S. and to give an alternative that was not what everybody was expecting because of the level of the Soviet Union development, because of the characteristics of the system they had. But it was at that time a forced maneuver in order to confront the aggression of the United States and to try to make the society viable. So these are concrete test case historical experiences that we think could fit in the whole analysis we are making in terms of transition from armed struggle to a revolutionary state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, معنا الدكتور روبرتو كاهينا بروفيسور في جامعة أمريكا الوسطى وبيشرف على الدراسات العليا في الجامعة الأمريكية في بنيكاراغوا. رح أقدم اليوم ورقة بعنوان The Changing Ethos of the Nicaraguan Military, 3 Stages, 3 Different Identities. Welcome.
First of all, I have to thank Professor Omar and the Arab Center for the invitation. And I don't know how Professor Omar managed to find me out.
Just turn on the microphone.
Sorry. I have to thank Professor Omar and the Arab Center for the invitation. And let me tell you that I don't have any idea how Professor Omar managed to find me out in Nicaragua. Yeah. Thousands of miles away from Qatar. Anyway, thank you again. Well, to begin with, let me tell you that Nicaragua is a small country located in Central America. Central America is a narrow strip of land connecting the North and the South America. Even though Nicaragua is the largest of the Central American countries, but it's one of the less populated. The history of Nicaragua is the history of political violence, civil wars, coup d'etat, political assassination, failed conspiracies, armed uprisings, revolution, and counter-revolutions. Besides, the Nicaraguan history has been heavily marked by persistent U.S. interventions, political interventions, financial intervention, and military intervention also. Going to the core of my paper, if we can see the institutional development of the Nicaraguan military, is it possible to distinguish 3 different stages, each one with its own characteristic, but not with continuity solution between them. The only continuum factor is the formality of the military institution itself. Such mutations, those 3 different stages are mutations, but they are not a result of the institutional development of the Nicaraguan military, but the influence of the political and economic and social surroundings or environments in Nicaragua. It could be said, taking an analogy from the universal literature, the Metamorphosis, written by Franz Kafka and published in 1915, that the Nicaraguan army is a Kafkian army. But if you go to zoology, we could say it's a chameleon army. Yeah, you know the chameleon, the small animal that changes colors for instance, is going to be attacked, and it mimicked with the environment, taking green or yellow or some different colors. Yeah. Well, and then if we are going to, I have found 3 different stages, as I said before. A heroic stage, which goes from 1979 to 1990, beginning with the shift from our guerrilla army to a regular army. The original identity of the popular Sandinista army, which was its first name, is not exactly military but politically. For instance, they took from the struggles of Nicaraguan national heroes like Benjamin Celedón, Augusto Cesandino, even Carlos Fonseca, the founder of the National Sandinista Liberation Front. And the military identity was especially revolutionary, politically, not military. Let me tell you that for the militaries, the former members of the guerrilla that became members of a regular army were more proud of the militancy, the political militancy, than the military ranks they have. The second stage is what I call the stage of accommodation for survival. It is the result of the general elections held in February 1990, which was lost by the National Sandinista Liberation Front. I will develop a little further ahead. And the last stage is the stage of material hedonism. The military personnel, but especially the top ranks, have become military entrepreneurs. And in Nicaragua, it's used to say businessmen in uniforms, because they have achieved a lot. They have achieved a lot of money through the Social Security Military Institute. For instance, let me tell you that by the beginning of the 2000 decade, there were about $40 million invested in the stock exchange in New York, through a company, Franklin Templeton, which is a conglomerate that has a smaller company, which its name is Investor Advisors. Yeah. So it was almost 16 years ago. You can imagine how much money have they accumulated 15 years or 16 years later. Well, now I'm going to focus on a couple of suggestions that kindly Professor Omar made me a few weeks ago. He asked me first to elaborate a little bit more in how and why the transformation of Sandinista happens in Nicaragua. Well, July 19th, 1979, and February the 25th, 1990, are two of the most relevant benchmarks in the Nicaragua recent history. The former was the day a national insurrection led by the National Sandinista Front overthrew the Somoza's family dictatorship. And the late was the day when, against all forecasts, the National Sandinista Liberation Front was defeated by a wide political opposition, a wide alliance of political opposition. Then became negotiations between the outgoing and the incoming government. The negotiations ended with the signing of the transition agreements. The transition agreements did not involve the National Sandinista Front as a party, but involved the state and especially involved the Nicaraguan military. So regarding the transformation of Sandinista, it is necessary to say that during the decade of the 1980s, as it happened in the Eastern Europe and even Cuba, there was what we call in Nicaragua the confusion between the state, the army, and the party. So we have to analyze in those three different levels the situation of the political and military in Nicaragua. The first level, the state, when the transition agreements were signed, the Nicaraguan army, but not the Sandinista National Liberation Front, was involved in a triple crisis: identity crisis, mission crisis, and legitimacy crisis. Identity, who we are now. War was ended. Who is the enemy? Who are going to kill? Who are we going to kill? And legitimacy is the Nicaraguan people, are the Nicaraguan people going to accept us after 10 years of civil war, a bloody civil war in our country? Well, the army, the Nicaraguan military solved the triple crisis, and successfully. If you read my paper, you're going to find the reasons, the causes of that. Elections in Nicaragua in February 1990 were not supposed to be in that date, but in November. But there was a regional negotiation process, and in August 1988, the president of Central America signed an agreement known as Esquipulas II, Esquipulas II. Esquipulas is a small city una city in Guatemala. Those agreements call for general elections, a commission for national reconciliation, and so on. So the Frente Sandinista, the National Liberation Front, decided to move the elections from November to February. All the forecasts of all studies of surveys of public opinion gave the National Liberation Front the victory, except one. And against all the forecasts, the National Liberation Front lost the election. The party was not affected as the party itself by the transition. But it is possible, it is necessary to say that the National Liberation Front, the National Sandinista Liberation Front, was not precisely a democratic party. It must be mentioned that during the decade, the function of this party was almost by the same model that it was organized as a guerrilla movement. Small cells, named base committees. Yeah. What the Frente Sandinista lost besides the election was the structure of the states, where the party, Frente Sandinista, used to function. And then it was an interesting process in which the party began a process of fragmentation. And that process of dispersion, of fragmentation, ended in 1990 when a group of Sandinistas, dissidents, moved out of the Frente Sandinista and formed another political party. The third level, which is one of the most interesting, not the most important, but one of the most interesting, is the military in Nicaragua. The military, as I told you, was brought to a triple crisis, but they were able to solve that triple crisis. Unlike the party, unlike the National Sandinista Liberation Front, the Nicaraguan military remained as a united body. They had no any internal dissidents. They had say the vertical command, and they accepted even the heavy conditions that the transitional agreements of March 1990 put on them. What? Reducing number, cut off the budget, cut off the whole ties between the army and the party, and all of the officers, high-rank officers, being part of the bureaucracy of the political bureaucracy of the National Sandinista Front, have to resign, and they did that. But it was not exactly the formality of the renounce and the current ties. It isn't. It doesn't mean that the high-rank military officers could the loyalty. They could the formal relations, but the loyalty to the Frente Sandinista remained. In return to the heavy conditions imposed over the army, the new government, the new civil government, recognizes and respects the career ladder and the military degrees. And the settlements were duty, as I told you, by the so-called transition agreements. But let me tell you that the army accepted the agreements not because they were democracy prone, but just to survive as an institution. Professor Omar also suggests me to elaborate a little bit more on internal debate within the organization about acting as a political party as opposed to a guerrilla organization, about leaving power after losing the elections. Unfortunately, Professor, and all of you, the debates were intense. There were debates and were intense, but were private. And no, they were not known by the general public, not even for specialists or political analysts. So I'm in debt with you, with all of you, because there is no public information about the internal and intense debates that were. The only thing that is known is that when Daniel Ortega, who was the president, who lost the elections in February 1990, said, "We are going to government from down." It means we are going to keep a share of power governing from down. Desde abajo, it says in Spanish. It meant strikes, political violence, and trying to destabilize the new civilian government. But the new civilian government survived because of the support of the Nicaraguan army, the Nicaraguan military. That was the new mission that the military found for itself, to support and defend the new democracy or the new democratic government in Nicaragua. So they found out the mission, they found out their identity and legitimacy. I was really amazed. 5 years after the National Liberation Front, Sandinista National Liberation Front, lost the elections, the Nicaraguan military was the #1 of the Nicaraguan political institution with more legitimacy, recognized by most of the part of the Nicaraguan population. It is, and it has been the same since probably 1996, 1994, up to date. I told you just a little bit before that it is more interesting what it happened within the army and the army relation with the new governments. There were 3 different governments, but there were not a complete democratic transition in Nicaragua. And now we have a real situation, political. I was telling my friend, my colleague, that we now have in Nicaragua almost 7 months of political violence unveiled by the government, the Ortega's government. And there have been more than 500 people assassinated, more than 2,000 injured, and hundreds of people captured, tortured, and using the police force and the paramilitary forces. But the army has remained a part of the crisis. And not is because they didn't want to. The real thing is that those millions they have invested in the stock exchange in New York could be frozen. The first shot killing a Nicaraguan, and it was told by one of the senators, Marco Rubio, if you do that, you're going to lose your investment in New York. The thing is that there are a lot of Nicaraguans asking why the Nicaraguan military do not intervene to stop the crisis. Let me tell you my reasons. If the military intervene to solve the Nicaraguan crisis, the Nicaraguan political crisis in Nicaragua, we are going to give them a blank chart. They are going to kidnap democracy, and they can do anytime they want or they need, take political decisions. Political power has not part of the missions of any army, any military, in any part of the world. So that's my reason. Even though the silence, the Nicaraguan military has been in during that 7 months of the crisis, is a sort of accomplished silence. Because keeping silence, they give a sort of subtle support to the Ortega's government in Nicaragua. Thank you. Was again my time.
I was about to start. All right, so we're just going to open it up to questions and discussion for a few minutes before we convene. Where's the mic? All right, I think it's wandering, but Dr. Ahmad, you can start. Okay, there we go.
I'm going to go in English. Thank you very, very much for that fascinating panel. Excellent. We have 2 cases of guerrilla victory and transitions, 3 cases of defeats and then transitions, and a bunch of cases of compromises in the Colombian case and then transition as well. Just very quickly, a question for Maria. So the blood factor, hindering the electoral victories, that has been a common case. Like Libya, has some of that, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. But in the Colombian case, you mentioned, or you referred to the M19 doing quite well in elections back in the 80s when it put down its arms, and then the FARC doing quite bad. In fact, we lost Antonio Navarro Wolf. He was supposed to come, but because he's running now in the elections for Bogota, he could not come. Antonio Navarro was a leader in the M19, another guerrilla movement, who negotiated a settlement and then became 3rd place in the presidential elections. So he had significant votes for him. So where is the difference in that sense between the M19 and the FARC? And by the way, 1,500, you said 1,500 defected out of 15,000 that put down arms, right? In the FARC case. That's so recidivism is about 10%. This is very good. Exactly, by international standards, it's actually very good, because in criminality or in criminology, usually have the rates of recidivism is somewhere between 50 and 67%. So this is actually, that's not bad. So and a final bit just about fake IDs. We tried to get Pastor Alape, but the problem was it's a fake ID, so I didn't want to go to jail, so that's why. All right, so moving on.
Thank you very much for your presentations. For Miss Maria, what we can expecting now after the refusing for the referendum regarding to the ceasefire or the peace agreement with the government and FARC? What we can expecting now? Thank you.
Thanks. This is more a reflection than a question, but it's addressed to Santiago. In the Cuban case, of course, you've portrayed a success story from the eyes of the revolutionaries. But what are your reflections in terms of human rights and freedoms and liberties in Cuba in the 21st century and in the past years? And if you were to put your hand in your heart, what changes would you make to the Cuban model and to the Cuban revolution?
Thank you very much for everyone. Just, I don't know if you had more details regarding the failure from the... It's in the paper, of your paper. Oh, it's an interesting point, which is a guerrilla to win in the mountains and to fail in the election. That's something we need to follow. So I want to ask if any more details about this in your paper. If yeah.
Okay, so I think we should
So, you know, what happened in Colombia was, you know, the story of our recent history, it's quite a paradox, I would say. What happened after 5 years of negotiation was that President Santos decided to propose a plebiscite, you see. That was the same, somehow the same case that happened in Guatemala. I don't know if you remember what happened in Guatemala. Guatemala, it was the same case in terms of, you know, they decided to cut up the deal with, you know, with the guerrilla there. And they decided as well to propose a plebiscite. Well, as it happens in Guatemala, Guatemala lost the plebiscite, and we did lost the plebiscite. I think that was the big mistake done by President Santos. I think, you know, everybody told him actually, you know, but he was wanting to regain in a way consensus through the ballots. And that was the idea, and that was the tool he maneuvered, and he presented that sort of tool to the public opinion. But I think that's one of the most difficult tasks we have to cope with, because from the very beginning, this peace process was born without legitimacy, you see. That is to say that we had to keep on, or President Santos at that time, President Santos alone, you know, as a Shakespearean character, you know, alone, you know, distracted or destroyed by their own mistakes, see, had to keep on, you know, pushing and trying to I mean, to manage the way to really, go through this terrible path. And the result of that, it's a very complex process, implementation, because we lack of legitimacy. That's one thing. And the second thing is that although President Santos managed to pass, you know, at least, you know, the most important, you know, reforms in terms of transitional justice, which is one of the most important things about the peace agreement. It's going to be the first transitional justice in the world that would address, for the first time, the perpetrators, all the perpetrators, you see. All the perpetrators, that's never done. Everybody's seeing, as a very nice experiment. We don't know if this is going to be a very nice experiment, but it still is the first one in the world. And so it means that in this new tribunal that is going to last 25 years, see, perpetrators, not only FARC, but as well members of the army and civilians that helped to finance paramilitary squads within the conflict, related to the conflict, would have to take into account there by the tribunal. So this is going to happen in the next 25 years. So on one side, that was, President Santos, that was the only thing that really left when he stepped out from office. But on the other hand, the whole implementation process, which is a huge thing, a huge task, was never done. This government has decided to implement it, or at least President Duque said, had said, that he's willing to go along with the implementation process, but still we don't know what's going to be his approach, because first of all, he doesn't agree with the word conflict, you see. They think the opposition were against always the peace treaty, that in Colombia there was no conflict, that the only thing that was happening in Colombia was a war waged by a terrorist group against a state that was a perfect state, a state that, was not degraded by the war, which was not the case. So President Santos decided to change that, decided to accept that there was a conflict, of course, in Colombia, and from that sort of premise, they built up the negotiation. So yes, that's a big thing, and that's why Las FARC had so bad, atmosphere in a way in the first, in the first time they went into the ballot. To tell you the truth, I thought they were going to do not very well. Because what happened as well in Colombia is that Las FARC, and that's answering your question, waged a war, throughout 60 years. I mean, it was the longest war in Latin America, and I think in the world, you see. So after 60 years of doing horrible things, terrorist attacks, kidnapping civilians, see, they didn't know that they had lost the popular support for the armed struggle. They didn't know that. And that's why they decided one day, after the military, gained a few battles, they decided to accept, to sit down with the government and make a peace treaty, because they knew that the struggle, through the armed struggle was no longer possible because they didn't have the political support and the popular support. That didn't happen with the M19. M19 was a quite different guerrilla. There was 20 years, it was 20 years after. It was 20 years less people being killed, although it was a very, aggressive guerrilla, I would say it was a terrorist guerrilla more than Las FARC. It was a nationalist guerrilla. It was a guerrilla that had certain relation with the young people in Colombia that didn't like Las FARC. You see, Las FARC was like something that was deep in depth in the regions and with the peasants outside in the outskirts of this country that we don't know. See, this is an urban area more like the Tupamaros, see? And so immediately they connected with the political arena and the political situation. So they were very successful, politically speaking. The first election, they were amazing, you know. But then they moved to the center and they lost the party. So it's amazing, you know, and they lost the party. But now they are the new leaders. They are regaining, you know, their strongholds, and they are kind of moving a little bit to the left, and they are hooking up forces with Las FARC, but they are leading for the first time, I would say the first central left movement in Colombia, which was completely, you know, something that nobody had dreamed before, because in Colombia, due to Las FARC, to be somebody from the left was like a sin, see? Right now, it's not like that. Things have changed, and that's what happened, but still we have a way to do things. Colombians still, I don't know why we are the only country that didn't vote for peace, which is amazing to understand that happened like that, but that happened.
I have a question.
Let me just
okay.
respond first.
And I have a question.
You guys can talk to each other after.
No, you know, and I just to do a parallel of what happening in Nicaragua, because it's very interesting. Why on earth we didn't do anything in terms of the military? You know, our peace process was somehow based on the experience of Nicaragua, Salvador, and what happened in Central America. So they decided, negotiators, they decided that the army was going to left alone. You know, the army was going to keep the whole structure, and you know, it was completely outside of the negotiation because of what happened in Central America. So what was incredible, and that gave the legitimacy to the process, was that the end of the conflict was negotiated between the military and the army, and Pastor Alape and Carlos Antonio Loza. Amazing, the two enemies for the last 60 years sat together, seeing each other's eyes. Amazingly enough, they signed the treaty, the end of the conflict, and amazingly enough, the FARC decided to ask the army to see what's possible to receive protection from them, you know, while they were traveling through all the country into the places where they have to be reunited for the end of the conflict, which was something that was agreed in the government. So you would have to see, you know, in the middle of this yes and no, the country divided, but the army and the guerrilla were completely one person, you know, one human being, you know, trying to see if the end of the conflict was possible. And it was because of them, because of the army, the Colombian army, amazing enough that we have peace in Colombia. So it's amazing, but it happened.
I'm sorry, they're never going to let me chair another panel, so we have to be on top. Go ahead.
I'm going to answer you with my two hands in my heart. I was referring to the historical period of 59, 61, and these issues were arising there very much. The first statements of the U.S. and some right-wing Latin American circles against the Cuban Revolution appeared in February, exactly along the lines of the respect of human rights of violators and killers who have been during Batista time. So in the case of Cuba, all the judgments of the prosecution being made to people who have been murdering a lot of Cubans, around 20,000, were made public. And that created a sense in Cuba that yes, this time the guys who came to power were about to finish the job and were not cowards in the Hispanic term of the war, because there have been other times in different political changes in Cuba when the rulers who came to power didn't finish, let's say, the needs and the interests and the demands of the population. But exactly this whole ideological struggle developed from the early months of the Cuban Revolution. February, March was very intense. So, and the whole debate was, oh, you didn't mention that during Batista. So there was a lot of military support to Batista, a lot of support from other Latin American elites at that time. Now you're talking about specific human rights of these guys or specific liberties, etc. Your question has more to do with general issues, more kind of philosophical. I'm just making more specific on because it depends on historical, concrete terms. For sure, if you are under attack, if you have around 3,000 paramilitary groups against your army, against your population doing sabotage, your priorities are to defend yourself, kind of national security. I think it's been obvious. As a matter of fact, Omar, maybe we should analyze here, as part of history, the case of the American Revolution, when they took power, George Washington, because they were unarmed, also the Minutemen. It's long history. But the American Revolution did that too. I mean, they expelled, and they violated a lot of specific rights of people that they deported or they emigrated for Canada, the so-called British Tories who were remained in the U.S. during the American Revolution. But yes, I mean, when there is that situation, sure, some liberties were cancelled, and they were not the same. Like for example, you have right now when there is the discussion of the Cuban Constitution. Then we should come to more conceptual issues of what do we understand, how we would analyze the issue of human rights or the issue of liberties, of the issue of freedoms. According to UN, has to be more integral, more systematic, more general. They complement each other. You cannot only prioritize one specific right of, for example, forming a party of specific group of people without denying other much more important rights in terms of the right to life, the right in terms of social gains, etc. So your question implies a lot of more philosophical discussion that I don't think we would have time here, but there is a big debate in UN because the West, and specific, for example, right now, yesterday, there were 8 amendments of the U.S. delegation against the Cuban resolution blockade, arguing the issue that they have the right to blockade because of their perception is that there were violated some human rights of some freedom. That's not your position for sure, but what I'm telling is very ideological, the issue of human rights, of freedom and liberties. I'm pretty much sure that comparative analysis in the Middle East, in other countries, would put this in a more balanced perspective. On the other hand, you cannot be naive in terms of conducting a process when you are confronting not only the U.S., you are confronting the whole bunch of mass media of general the West, right, who considers the Cuban example, the Cuban experience to be very subversive in itself because of the gains of the revolution. And Carter was the first who started to use human rights as a weapon to make a regime change. So you have to understand that. I mean, it's not only the issue of analyzing conceptual issues, is things that have to do with stability, with national security, etc. Right now, you ask me what would I think in terms of nowadays. I mean, every society is perfectionable for sure. There are a lot of problems in Cuba nowadays. It has to do with the increase in inequality. It has to do with the possibility openness of debate, etc. But I don't know if you're familiar with the whole discussion of the new project of the Constitution. Gosh, there are complete article which it's around 4 or 5 paragraphs on rights, on freedoms of people, and the concept of making socialist state of right. I think it's very important, and there are a lot of specific personal guarantees which are recognized by the Constitution. Maybe before were not recognized at the constitutional level, but the civil code and the penal code included them. So I think it's, maybe Omar is going to invite us in Doha for make an analysis similar to this in a comparative perspective. But I'm pretty much sure that the Cuban experience and the Cuban reality in human rights, thinking more general in terms of human rights, in terms of freedoms, in terms of liberties, in terms of equality, surpass a lot of Latin American countries which formally do have specific recognized or specific issues linked with those problems, but reality is much more difficult, as we have been talking about here. Thank you.
Okay. So, I'm sorry, because we're running out of time, so maybe we could talk after.
Personally.
Yeah, we can talk after. Okay, perfect. It's fine, we have some time? I thought we were over time. Okay, if we can cut it down to 5 minutes.
Fight for your human right to speak.
I have two, one question for Maria Celina and and an observation. I'm not sure that they didn't know they were losing support. What I guess is they didn't want to accept. They knew that. They knew that. I'm talking about based on personal experiences in Nicaragua. Yeah, that one thing. The other thing is that regarding the negociators, the role of the army in Nicaragua, the transition was negotiated between the outgoing government and the incoming government. And for the outgoing government, the head of the negotiators was the head of the army. Yeah. And that's why the Nicaraguan army could survive as it was. Yeah?
I agree with you. No, I agree with you. I know but what is interesting is the role of the armies. They have a different role, but very important role in terms of preserving the peace process, which I think it's the great conclusion we can drive off all this.
A final comment, after flying the rest of the world, look at how much energy the Latin American panel has.
Thank you everyone for attending,
well.
and we'll see you tomorrow.